All right, guys, so we're gonna be doing the community tier list this time around, and this time I did it a little bit different. We didn't do by full vote. What we did was we went through and found a bunch of people on Twitch and asked them, hey, can you guys help us build a tier list for all the new players for 2022? We're gonna go over 3 different categories in this tier list. The first is gonna be primary damaging characters for 5-star main DPS. The second is going to be supports and characters that boost your team composition. And third are sub DPS characters that really help your overall damage on teams by actually just providing off-field damage, so your mains can do a lot more while they're on the field. Jump into it. So we've done a lot of tier lists in the past for community tier lists based upon what people have been asking me to do for the community for Genshin Impact. And we talked about a lot of different ways of ranking characters, whether it be through community tier lists, by vote, by talking about different players, different characters, etc. And on the most recent one, a lot of people had comments based upon like what they wanted to play and what people wanted to see as far as like where characters were in a tier list and where they would lie. And there was too much confusion that people would have with the current format. So I decided to change the format of this tier list in order to help be more clear, so players that didn't really understand all aspects of the game we were talking about, they could actually see everything in a more concise format. So I had about a 45-minute recording of this whole thing, and I ended up wanting to condense this part down into a very small, brief section to talk about support characters. So first, we're going to talk about these support characters. The best 2 in the game, of course, are Kazuha and Bennett. Moving down the list, of course, we have Sucrose, Zhongli, Goru, Shenhe, as well as Sarah. All 5 of these characters are more specialized supports for different kinds of regions. For example, Zhongli is a character that really helps for Anemo teams and Geo teams specifically, but really doesn't help that much for elemental teams, because what happens is that he provides a 20% elemental shred bonus, but it's only really valuable for for Anemo as well as Geo teams, because other characters have access to the Veritas and Venerus set that are on Anemo characters. So it's a more specialized support for those types of damage. It's also very good for physical team compositions as well. And we got Goru, really specialized for Geo, Shenhe, of course, for Cryo, and of course, Sarah for all Electro teams. And then we have Sucrose, who is basically just an elemental mastery booster for boosting reactions, which is not always helpful. It does help in certain elemental teams, and it is really good with Kazuha, but not always as good. Dropping down to the S tier, these are all characters that are really good for boosting in some particular way, but of course, since you're not going to be auto-attacking on these characters as support characters, they are characters that really do help out in a big way for giving yourself healing, damage, etc. But the main thing that we're judging on is how much they damage boost the rest of the characters in your team, and they do provide some bonuses here, but they are not ideal. And of course, characters in the A tier don't really have any kind of major supporting potential. They're all kind of okay characters, they just don't have the best version of what they can do. And B tier characters all have like side potential of like small boosts that don't really help your team overall, but they do help in very niche ways. Next, we have the sub DPS category. These are characters that are really good for off-field damage dealing. The best characters, of course, being Zhangling, Shinkus, Beidou, Kazuha, and Albedo. All of them are exceptionally high damaging characters that can do really good support potential for your team by giving off-field damage so you don't have to actually be on field to touch it. The characters that are just below these characters, of course, are Fischl, Mona, Eula, as well as Ayaka, Sarah, and Shenhe. All of these characters are close to the damage that those original characters can do, but are not quite there, because what they actually do provide is more supporting potential in different ways, or either that or they're actually main DPS characters in general. Now, in general, these are very strong characters for just using elemental skill, elemental burst combinations, and they do very well, but they're not as good as some of the 4-star counterparts. Now, if we go down to the S tier, these are characters that do really well as an elemental skill, elemental burst combination character, but are outstripped by other characters that do exist. Now, the reason Raiden Shogun is so low on this list, if you were wondering, is because Raiden Shogun as a character is going to rely heavily on her normal and charge attacks, which should be rated in a different part of the video as far as what she does for an actual main DPS, not as a sub DPS, because the main DPS is a character that relies really heavily on those normal and charge attacks. If you were just relying on the elemental skill as well as the elemental burst cast for Raiden Shogun, she is not as strong. The damage potential on Zhongli, while getting 100k meteors usually, as far as what you can really pull off, really kind of falls off because what you're going to be using it for most of the time is a Milithus set, and he really doesn't break that high damage when you're using that with him. As far as the lower tier characters like Bennett, Chungyang, etc., those characters are really heavily reliant on Noblesse sets, and if you try to use Crimson Witch on them or using reverse reaction teams on them, they don't do as high damage as other characters as listed. They do very well, they're just not as good as far as what the damage potential of these characters is. And the reason some of these characters not even considered as sub DPS is because a lot of these characters have burst modes like Yoimiya and Zhao. Of course, Yoimiya, Zhao, Hu Tao as well as Ito all have burst mode kind of abilities, whether you pop an elemental skill or an elemental burst, and you start normal charge attacking to use more of your damage, and you don't actually have any damage in your ultimate, etc., or your elemental skill. I like sub DPS characters the best in Genshin Impact because I like the value of having these characters use their elemental skill, elemental burst, and then switch over to other characters that I really want to stay out for a longer period of time to get lots of damage in. So a lot of this information was captured directly from a lot of people throughout Genshin Impact and my community for Twitch, and a lot of them, of course, is actually brought from spiralabyss.org as well. You can see that there are actually a lot of different ways that people have been using 4-star and 5-star DPS over the course of time, and I actually recorded this in a video a couple weeks ago, based upon where people are actually going to be in Spiral Abyss over the course of time throughout different patches. And there actually goes over different 4-star characters and 5-star characters as sub DPS as well as DPS characters that really start losing popularity or gaining popularity based upon where they are in the current state of meta. We're going to be going over the main DPS characters in Genshin, and we're going to be talking about all the 5-stars. We're not going to consider any 4-stars in this list because it's way too complex to add in 4-stars to main DPS potential because people are just going to get weird about it. So there are about 6 characters in Genshin that we're not even consider as primary DPS characters or main DPS characters. In general, you're not going to use auto attacks on these characters to deal damage. First on the list, we got Diluc, Aloy, and Mona in the B tier. The reason these characters are so low is because Diluc's on-field damage is super low in comparison to other characters, and he doesn't really provide any kind of value to team compositions for boosting damage. Unfortunately, he's one of the weaker 5-stars in Genshin, and he doesn't have anything impactful in his kit to actually boost damage even further. And as field time is also extremely high for low damage. And the only way they're really getting damage on him is by using a Xingqiu in order to give yourself more damage on team for vaporized reactions, and they're all quite low. Aloy is one of the weakest characters in Genshin in general, and of course we got Mona, who is not a great main DPS for auto attack damage, and really can only be due for damage per screenshot builds on a sub DPS build. Next up, we have the A tier characters. And these characters are going to be the characters that a lot of people are going to have contests with. We have Klee, Tartaglia, Eula, Kazuha, Zhao, and Keqing. All of these characters as a main DPS or characters that rely heavily on normal and charge attacks are not the best. They do really well, but they are not using those to their max potential. The reason we have Tartaglia and Klee here first, I'm going to talk about those two first, is because both of these characters, while extremely good, they do have issues. And their issues kind of stem from being able to get the damage in from just normal charge attack and rely heavily on other characters dealing the damage on the as main DPS. Those two characters are what are called enabler characters, and they usually like tee up reactions in a different way. But the damage on both Tartaglia and Klee is actually not boosted in any significant fashion, so you really don't get a large damage boosted on because they're mostly just their own pure damage for normal and charge. Eula has one of the highest damage hits for a normal attack in the entire game as a Claymore user and is a great character as a main DPS, but is not one of those characters that's really going to carry you through the normal and charge attacks. Typically, what happens for Eula is she's really good for her elemental burst, but not so much so for auto attacks, even though they do about 20,000 damage per hit. Next up, we got Kazuha. And as a character for a main DPS, he does have potential as main DPS, but the argument for him and using his normal and charge attacks is not the greatest. He usually uses elemental skill and then does a plunge attack right afterward for the damage, does an elemental burst, and then leaves the field. Typically, that's not really considered a main DPS, but there are ways of using a Constellation 6 Bennett in order to make that boosted, or using Chungyang and other factors to actually get damage in. And now with the new Shenhe introduction, you can actually use Kazuha as a cryo build, so it does have potential to be good at Constellation 0 with refined one weapon like a Mist-Splitter, but for this, I'm going to put him down and lower in the tier because he's not going to be super high impactful DPS on your team composition. He will be better than pretty much Diluc and Mona though, so that's a little bit better. Now, we got characters like Zhao and Keqing. These are pure damage characters that rely on just their damage alone. The whole team is going to be carried by these two characters, and that's where the damage is coming in. Sarah can actually carry Keqing's damage up quite high, and she does a lot more damage now than she did in the release of the game. With both Sarah and Kazuha to boost, you can actually use Keqing very effectively, and her damage is quite high for her on-field time, and her charge attacks actually do a significant amount of damage when you're doing it. I think you can get somewhere about 30,000 damage charge attacks on your actual charge attacks per hit. So you're doing like 60,000 damage charge attacks, which is on par with Hu Tao once you use a Sarah as well as a Kazuha with it. So it is quite high as far as her overall damage goes. For Zhao, you can get about 80,000 damage plunge attacks or so, maybe about 90,000 if you're using a refined 1 weapon. Sometimes you can even over 100,000 for plunge attacks, but there's no other damage being dealt at the same time with the team compositions for Zhao. So you do get quite high damage, but the problem with Zhao is the field time damage is really high, while the downtime is really high as well. So in order to get the high damage, you also have to trade out for high field time, high downtime. So it really plays against you in that kind of aspect if you're going to be building for the high damage plunge attacks while also getting the high off time. So it's like kind of a high risk, high reward. Overall, he would be higher if he didn't have that issue, and he kind of needs a support. And if he gets a better support in general in the future, like a defense shredding character or another character that you can use at Constellation 0 with Refine 1, you will actually see somewhat of a damage boost on Zhao. And if Yunjin was actually a character that boosted Zhao, he'd definitely be higher in the tier list. Next up, we got the 3 characters that a lot of people are not going to like in this tier list, but you know, it has been proven this to even talk about. We have Yoimiya, Hu Tao, as well as Kokomi. A lot of people shit on Yoimiya as well as Kokomi as far as their damage being dealt, but it has been proven over many different showcases that Yoimiya and Hu Tao actually have similar damage on their team compositions as well as similar clear speeds over every single content in Genshin at Constellation 0 to Constellation 0 with Refine 1 weapon to Refine 1 weapon. Many people have shown this over all the content in Genshin and shown that Yoimiya and Hu Tao have very, very similar different damage aspects. The difference being that Yoimiya is a bow user and a single target character, whereas Hu Tao is more of an AoE character at certain times for ultimate, but typically is a single target character on charge attacks. So between the two, they're both pretty much single target characters, whereas you can use AoE on Hu Tao sometimes. Now, the only reason Kokomi as a DPS character is quite high is because of 2 major things. The first is that Kokomi actually does the same amount of damage for normal attacks as Tartaglia. Normal attack wise, she does the same. Now, in addition to that, she also heals and tanks with the same set. Now, with her new artifact set, her on-field damage or her overall bubble pops does the same damage when it's on-field or off-field as Tartaglia's ultimate if you total all of the map. So each of the 30,000 damage hits that you're dealing will actually total up to being a Tartaglia's ultimate damage. So as far as a main DPS damage dealer goes, she can do the same thing as Tartaglia with Tartaglia's team on the same damage as Tartaglia's team, but also heal and tank. And she also has all their alternate teams that were really, really valuable in today's meta, where you can run Beidou, Fischl, as well as Yunjin with her. So it's just tons of other characters that can run with Kokomi. So she's one of the most versatile characters that can run in main DPS in Genshin. So she's a really, really strong character. Next up in the SS tier, we got Ganyu. She's awesome, but unfortunately, there's a problem with Ganyu. Ganyu is less awesome than these chads. Now, Ito, Ganyu, Ayaka are all exceptional DPS characters, but through testing, we actually were trying to figure out how good Ganyu is. Now, Ganyu's best team composition comes from a melt build. If you wanted to do the biggest damage on Ganyu, you are typically going to be using a melt composition, and you're doing over 200,000 damage for your melt procs. Unfortunately, though, the melt team for Ganyus are a little bit problematic, and you have to rely on getting an elemental skill on the enemy, and if they cannot be applied with an elemental skill, there is a major issue against them. So, for example, if you wanted to figure out why Ganyu isn't as high on the tier list, just think about the emblem of Severed Fate domain. In that domain, there is an entire set of enemies that have an electro innate particle on them. And if you're trying to use Ganyu on a melt composition in that domain, it does literally nothing. There are tons of situations that crop up like this in Genshin Impact, so just know that this is not the singular instance where this only happens in one place. This happens all the time for melt builds. You have to be able to apply pyro to an enemy in order to do a melt composition for Ganyu. And those situations where you're not able to do that crop up quite often. Now the thing is, that makes Ganyu's best team a freeze composition. And because that would be a freeze composition, there is a character that got introduced, and that's Shenhe. Shenhe on freeze compositions is a best-in-slot character for boosting those teams. And because she is a best-in-slot character, the better character between the two characters, between Ayaka and Ganyu, is going to be Ayaka now. Because Ayaka will actually receive such a significant bump from Shenhe in comparison to Ganyu that you're actually getting a much overall higher damage increase. And because Ganyu can actually not get the bigger damage increases on those builds, you will see a much more sizable damage increase over there. Both Ito and Raiden Shogun have characters that are specifically geared to support them. And those two characters are Sarah as well as Goru. Both of those characters boost these two characters to the next level, and you see a huge damage increase from these characters in comparison to other DPS. Now, what I see in the future for Genshin is that there are going to be more supports that are going to be unilaterally built to help out certain main DPS. And if that happens, then there's going to be more and more support characters that are supposed to help the specific main DPS, kind of like how Ito is, as well as Raiden Shogun is. You're going to see those characters be more and more popular, and they're going to start getting stronger and stronger. All right, guys, well, let's get into this video. My name's Sekapoko. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you guys did enjoy the video, of course, like, subscribe. Let me know what you guys think about these ratings for the characters in the comment section down below. You have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace.